Have you ever asked yourself, how do I hear God speak to me? Well, let's take a look at Samuel. Samuel's one of my favorite people in the Bible. I know there's a lot of great people in the Bible, but there's just something about the story of Samuel that sticks out to me. One of my favorite things about him is that he was raised in the house of the Lord. He loved God and he was around the things of the God from a very young age. But one thing that Samuel had to do at the very beginning of his story was he had to learn to hear and recognize God's voice. Like many of us, we usually know, if you're a Christian, you know that God can speak to you. But there comes a time in your life where you have to hear God's voice for yourself. There's a place that we go to church and we hear God speaking through our pastors and our teachers and all these amazing things. But you also have to learn to hear God's voice for yourself. Just like Samuel. 3 separate times when God was trying to speak to him, he went to Eli and he was like, hey, Eli, what is it that you're trying to tell me? And Eli's like, I'm not trying to tell you anything. So finally, the 3rd time, Eli realized it's God who wants to speak to Samuel. So he sent Samuel back to his bed and he says, when you hear God speak, I want you to say, speak, for your servant is listening. I can tell you with confidence that God wants to speak with you. So you don't have to question, does God want to speak to me or will he speak to me? He wants to speak to you and he loves speaking to you. But we just have to gain a confidence that we can hear God's voice. Just like a natural relationship, when you have a natural relationship, the more that you know someone, the more that you start recognizing their voice. If I had an unknown number that called me and my husband was on the other line, I wouldn't have to check the number or ask who's talking to me because I know my husband's voice. That's the kind of relationship that God wants to have with us, that when he speaks to us, we know his voice. So you just have to get into the routine of constantly listening and hearing God's voice. So the moment that he speaks to you, you're able to recognize his voice. So if you're feeling doubt about whether or not God wants to speak to you, I want to tell you today that he wants to speak to you. But you got to get into the place where you're listening. Samuel, he was someone that he was eventually able to hear God's voice, but Samuel actually listened to God's voice. And because he listened to what God was telling him to do, he was able to go on to be a spokesperson, a prophet for God to some really amazing people in the Bible. So God wants to speak to you and God wants to reveal some really awesome things to you, but you have to learn to hear his voice and also listen to him. So if you're that person who's questioning it, I just want to encourage you today, get in the Word. Obviously, God speaks to us through his Word, but also just calm your spirit, calm your mind, calm your heart, and get to that place where you're really listening for God's voice. And then I want you to say this, speak, for your servant hears.